This is a podcast of the Nuffield Department of Medicine. Today we speak with Professor Kevin Baird about his research on infectious diseases in Indonesia. Which infectious diseases are a big problem in Indonesia?
Well, I think it's the same infections that affect tropical countries that struggle with getting healthcare services out to their peripheries. So people have difficulty accessing healthcare. And it's the same three, I think, in most tropical countries. It's HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria. The Global Fund's big three. Those are good investments. But there's also many other important infections that are not typically addressed in Indonesia. Lymphatic filariasis, dengue fever, Japanese encephalitis, leptospirosis, and others that I can't tick off. And I think it's important to realize that Indonesia is a very large country. It's 250 million people, 14,000 islands, and over 5,000 kilometers in length. And to give you a perspective, that's like from London to Kabul, Afghanistan. So this is a massive piece of real estate that the Indonesian government struggles to provide adequate healthcare services all across that and on every island. So yes, they struggle, and I think that is one of their key challenges.
How can the burden of those diseases be reduced?
Yeah, well, I look at that question through the same lens of the challenges and limitations imposed by geography and economics. And because of my experience in Indonesia, I've become a strong advocate for very simple and affordable point-of-care diagnostics. If we can't diagnose infections, we can't treat them, we can't beat them back. And the people most affected by these infections do not have access to laboratories. So I think if we make progress in point-of-care diagnostics, we're going to really make significant progress against many of these infections.
Can you talk a little bit more about the treatment and prevention of Plasmodium vivax?
Yes, that actually is a poster child of the issue of having access to diagnostics. And to understand that, I have to explain a bit about the biology of that parasite. So Plasmodium vivax malaria is actually two infections. On the one hand, it causes an acute attack and disease that must be treated, and we have drugs that treat that. On the other hand, it also has a stage that goes dormant and awakens in the months to follow and causes more clinical attacks. And that stage is called a hypnozoite, and we need a separate treatment for that stage, a hypnozoiticide. The only drug that we have is called primaquine, and that drug happens to be hemolytically toxic to patients who have an inborn abnormality called G6PD deficiency. Now, unfortunately, G6PD deficiency is quite common where there's malaria, about 8%. So if patients receive treatment against that latent stage of Plasmodium vivax, and we don't know their G6PD status, actually their life is at risk. It's so toxic that it can end in death, and has ended in death. So there's this terrible therapeutic dilemma that we face, and providers face with every P. vivax patient. Do we give the treatment and risk harm because of G6PD, or do we withhold treatment and allow the parasite to do its harm? And a point-of-care diagnostic that allows us to sort out who's G6PD normal and who's not allows us to treat people for Plasmodium vivax, where today, in truth, that rarely happens, and it's a serious problem, and it's a diagnostic problem.
What are the most important lines of research that have developed in the past 5 to 10 years in this area?
Yeah, with respect to Plasmodium vivax, we've actually made great strides in the past decade or so. The malaria research community has sorted out some very important dogma, discredited dogma now. The first is that for decades we were all taught in school that Plasmodium vivax was actually relatively harmless. It rarely caused death. It was kind of a mild infection. When we go into hospitals and survey patients with the infection, actually we find the opposite is true. They very often, almost as often as P. falciparum, they develop severe disease syndromes that are associated with a fatal outcome. So we now appreciate that Plasmodium vivax actually threatens life, and this gives us a perspective to take it more seriously and perhaps more aggressively. The second discovery was the importance of that latent hypnozoite stage in terms of the epidemiology of this infection. It turns out that in endemic areas, more than 80% of the acute attacks that we see in patients come from the liver, not a mosquito. And this is very important in terms of understanding how to control the infection. The third important advance, and this is simply connecting those two dots. It informed us of the necessity of addressing this G6PD diagnostic problem and ensuring that every patient that's diagnosed with Plasmodium vivax is treated against those relapses safely.
Why is your research so important, and why should we fund it?
I think there's a simple way to put that. We just need to look back over the past 65 years. Primaquine has been available for 65 years, but the people most in need of it have had no access to it. And all we need to do is think about those decades, the untreated infections, and the clinical attacks that have occurred. I mean, it's uncountable numbers of infections. Now that we understand this problem, we can take steps, and we are, to resolve it and get Plasmodium vivax treated every time.
Finally, how does your research fit within translational medicine within the department?
Well, looking at translational research as simply research aimed at more directly at better health outcomes. I think a lot of research laboratories typically advance the front of some technology and move it forward, push that envelope of technology, and then try to translate that to a better health outcome. Look for an illness that it's relevant. And in Indonesia, and it has a lot to do with that geography, where very often the sick patient is right in front of us, we take the inverse approach. Our starting point for translational research is a sick patient, and then to shop the available technology to see how can we improve this patient's health outcome. And that approach largely explains the emphasis of clinical trials at the unit in Jakarta. We mostly do clinical trials. And I view that as a technology, actually. Doing randomized clinical controlled trials is not simple. It's a technology, and it's a skill set that has to be acquired by practice and learning. And that's what we try to do in Indonesia, is develop a team that can do randomized clinical trials that can be applied not just to malaria, but to other infections. And in fact, my team will be undertaking a randomized controlled trial for TB meningitis at 2 hospitals in Jakarta this year. It's the same people, and it's the same skill sets, but it's a different disease. And that's the business of translational medicine. And I might add that our Indonesian friends and partners embrace this very much. This is what they want and expect from us, is better health outcomes for their patients. And that's what we strive to deliver.
Thanks very much.
My pleasure.